In 2014, a team of Italian archaeologists working outside Rome made a discovery that would rewrite everything we thought we knew about the Roman Empire. Beneath the ruins of what appeared to be a luxury villa, they found a sealed underground chamber that had not been opened in nearly 1,900 years. When the heavy stone slab was finally lifted, the air that escaped carried the faint chemical signature of ancient lime, the substance Romans used to accelerate decomposition. Inside that chamber lay 127 skeletons arranged in careful rows. Every single one belonged to a male between the ages of 11 and 19. Their bones told stories that no history textbook had ever printed. Fracture patterns consistent with repeated physical trauma. Signs of surgical modification performed without anesthesia. Stress markers in their teeth and vertebrae that forensic specialists associated with years of chronic psychological torture. But the most disturbing discovery was not the bones, it was the ledger. Sealed in a clay jar beside the burial chamber, archaeologists recovered a leather-bound record book containing over 3,000 entries, spanning roughly a century of continuous operation. Each entry documented a death with clinical precision. Name, approximate age, date of disposal, cause of termination, and a final notation that appeared again and again across thousands of lines. Inventory reduced by 1 unit, replacement required from current stock. This was not a prison. This was not a military camp. This was a business, and its product was children. The facility that archaeologists uncovered was one of an estimated 200 similar operations that functioned across the Roman Empire for over 5 centuries. Together, they consumed the lives of more than 800,000 young men, feeding them into a machine of systematic exploitation that operated with the efficiency of a modern corporation and the cruelty of a nightmare. Today, we are going to follow one of those 3,000 names through the machine that destroyed him. His name was Marcus, and his story begins not in Rome, but in the green hills of central Gaul, in a world that still smelled of grass and honest labor. Before we begin this journey into one of history's most carefully hidden horrors, if you find value in uncovering these buried truths, consider hitting that subscribe button and leaving a comment below telling me where you are listening from. It means the world to me that we are exploring these ancient stories together, from different corners of the globe connected across time and distance, by our shared determination to remember what powerful people tried to erase. Part 1. The Wooden Horse. In the spring of 94 AD, in a small farming settlement near what is now the city of Lyon in southern France, a boy named Marcus Decimus helped his father repair a stone wall that bordered their modest wheat field. Marcus was 11 years old, brown-haired and lean from outdoor work with quick hands that were equally comfortable guiding a plow or carving small animals from scraps of wood. His father, Lucius Decimus, was a freedman who had earned his liberty through 15 years of service to a Roman magistrate stationed in Gaul. With his freedom came a small plot of land enough to sustain a family if the weather cooperated and the tax collectors showed restraint. Lucius had married a local Gallic woman named Bridget, and together they had built something rare for people of their station, a life that belonged to them. Marcus knew this story because his father told it often, usually in the evenings when the work was done, and they sat together watching the sun turn the hills to copper and gold. His father would describe the years of service, the patience required, the small victories that accumulated into eventual freedom. And he would always end the same way. Everything I endured was so that you would never have to. You were born free, Marcus. That is my greatest accomplishment. On the evening after they finished the wall, Lucius carved a small wooden horse for Marcus. It was a simple thing, no bigger than a child's fist, but it was made with the careful attention of a man who understood craftsmanship as an expression of love. The horse had a flowing mane and legs positioned mid-gallop as if it were racing across the very fields where Marcus played. He tucked it into his belt and kept it there every day afterward, a small, warm weight against his hip that reminded him of his father's hands and his father's promise. That promise broke 6 months later. The harvest of 94 AD was catastrophic across southern Gaul. A late frost killed the early wheat and drought withered what remained. Lucius Decimus watched his entire crop fail in the space of 3 weeks, transforming a year of labor into dust that blew across barren fields. The tax collectors did not care about weather. Rome demanded its tribute regardless of what the land produced, and the penalties for non-payment escalated with mathematical cruelty. First came fines, then seizure of property, then the final option that Roman law provided for debtors who had exhausted every other resource. The sale of family members. Marcus did not understand what was happening the morning two men arrived at their farmstead with documents bearing official seals. His mother was crying, which was unusual because Bridget was a woman who expressed emotion through action rather than tears. His father stood rigid, his face carrying an expression Marcus had never seen before. Something beyond sadness, closer to the look of a man watching his own house burn with no way to reach the water. The transaction was completed in less than an hour. Marcus was assessed, documented, and legally transferred to a slave trader named Quintus Servilius, who operated a network connecting rural Gaul to the urban markets of Rome and its surrounding cities. The price paid for Marcus was enough to clear his father's debts with a small surplus, meaning the farm would survive and his parents would not face imprisonment. This was how the system justified itself, not as cruelty but as economic necessity. Not as the destruction of a child, but as the salvation of a family. His father held him for a long time before the trader's men led him to the wagon. Lucius pressed his face against his son's hair and whispered words that Marcus would carry for the rest of his short life. Remember who you are, remember that you were loved, and remember that I will come for you. It was the last time Marcus saw his father. The journey from Gaul to the slave markets of southern Italy took nearly 5 weeks. Marcus traveled in a covered wagon with 7 other children, all of them acquired from failed farms and desperate families across the region. They ranged in age from 9 to 14, and they shared the hollow-eyed silence of young people processing experiences too large for their understanding. Quintus Servilius was not unnecessarily cruel during the transport. Damaged goods fetched lower prices, and his business model depended on delivering children in presentable condition. They were fed, adequately allowed to sleep in reasonable comfort, and given basic medical attention when illness appeared. This practical kindness was more disturbing than outright brutality because it revealed the commercial calculation behind every decision. Marcus was being maintained the way a merchant maintains inventory kept viable, not out of compassion, but out of concern for profit margins. During the journey, Marcus kept his wooden horse hidden inside his tunic, pressing it against his chest at night when the darkness made everything worse. The other children had their own talismans: a lock of a mother's hair, a small stone from a family hearth, a scrap of fabric torn from a sister's dress. These objects were technically forbidden as traders preferred to begin the process of identity erasure during transport. But Quintus tolerated them during the journey, understanding that the final stripping of personal possessions could be left to the buyers. Marcus was sold at the regional market in Capua to a household steward acting on behalf of a wealthy Roman citizen named Gaius Aurelius Maximus. The purchase was unremarkable by Roman standards. A healthy Gallic boy of 11, suitable for household service, priced at the mid-range of the current market. Marcus was loaded into another wagon and transported to the Aurelius estate outside Rome, beginning what he believed would be his life as a household slave. For 2 years, that is exactly what it was. The Aurelius household was large and efficiently run, with over 40 slaves performing the various functions required to maintain the lifestyle of a wealthy Roman family. Marcus was assigned to general household duties, cleaning the marble floors of the atrium, polishing bronze fixtures, carrying messages between different parts of the estate. The work was not physically demanding compared to farm labor, and the food was better than anything he had known in Gaul. But the psychological reality of slavery revealed itself gradually like a poison that takes months to show its full effects. Marcus learned that his name could be changed at his master's whim. He learned that his daily schedule was not his own, that his meals could be withheld for minor infractions, that his sleeping quarters could be relocated without notice or explanation. He learned that other slaves would inform on him if they believed it would earn them favor, and that the concept of privacy simply did not exist for someone in his position. Most importantly, he learned to read the invisible hierarchy that governed every interaction within the household. Which slaves had the master's ear, and which were being slowly pushed towards sale or disposal, which behaviors earned approval, and which attracted the kind of attention that left marks hidden beneath tunics. He learned to stand perfectly still during inspections, to keep his eyes downcast to make his breathing shallow and his presence as unobtrusive as possible. Through it all, he kept the wooden horse hidden. He had carved a small cavity in the underside of his sleeping pallet where the horse fit perfectly invisible to anyone who was not specifically searching for it. At night, when the other slaves were asleep and the great house settled into its dark silence, Marcus would hold the horse against his chest and remember the feel of his father's workshop, the smell of wood shavings, the sound of his mother singing while she prepared the evening meal. These memories were his real possessions, and he guarded them more carefully than any physical object. The morning everything changed began like any other morning in the early autumn of 96 AD. Marcus was 13 years old, taller now, and beginning to show the first signs of the transition from boyhood to adolescence. He had been with the Aurelius household long enough to understand its rhythms to predict which days would be demanding and which would pass in routine monotony. But this morning felt wrong in ways he could not articulate. The other servants moved with unusual speed, their eyes sliding away from his whenever he tried to make contact. The kitchen was producing food far beyond the normal daily requirements, the kind of elaborate preparation reserved for visitors of exceptional importance. Something significant was being planned, and Marcus was apparently connected to it in ways that everyone understood except him. The confirmation came when Gaius Aurelius himself entered the servants' quarters shortly after dawn. In 2 years of service, Marcus had never seen the master in this part of the house. Gaius communicated with his slaves through the head steward, maintaining the social distance that Roman custom prescribed between a citizen of his rank and his human property. His presence in the servants' quarters was as unusual as finding a senator in a grain warehouse. Gaius walked directly to Marcus and began an inspection more thorough than anything the boy had experienced. He examined Marcus's teeth, checking for disease and alignment. He tested the boy's reflexes by tapping his knees and elbows. He ran his hands through Marcus's dark hair, which had been oiled that morning, according to household standards. Then he pulled back the boy's tunic and examined his chest, shoulders, and back with an attention that made Marcus's skin contract with a cold that had nothing to do with the autumn air. The inspection lasted perhaps 5 minutes, but to Marcus it felt like an hour. When Gaius finally stepped back, he nodded to the steward and spoke 4 words that Marcus would later understand as his death sentence. He will do nicely. The buyers arrived at midday. Their litters announced wealth that exceeded even the considerable resources of Gaius Aurelius, with gold fittings and silk curtains that spoke of senatorial rank or higher. 3 men emerged, middle-aged and physically soft, in the way of Romans, whose power was exercised through words and money rather than physical labor. They wore togas with the broad purple stripe of the senatorial class, and they moved through the Aurelius villa with the casual authority of men accustomed to owning everything they surveyed. Marcus watched from the kitchen doorway as the visitors were escorted to the villa's most prestigious reception room, a space reserved for guests of the highest importance. Through the partially open door, he caught fragments of conversation punctuated by laughter that compressed his stomach into a knot of unnamed dread. He had been sold before, and his body remembered the sensations, even if his mind tried to resist the comparison. The same tightness in his chest, the same metallic taste on his tongue, the same feeling of the ground shifting beneath feet that had nowhere stable to stand. The summons came in the late afternoon. Marcus was ordered to bathe in scented water oil his skin until it reflected the lamplight, and dress in a tunic he had never seen before, made of fabric finer than anything a household slave would normally wear. His hair was arranged in the Greek style that Roman aesthetics favored for young men, with careful curls framing his face in a way that emphasized his features. When Marcus caught his reflection in a polished bronze mirror, he did not recognize himself. The boy looking back at him was not a household servant. He was something else entirely, something prepared for display. The reception room fell silent when Marcus entered. The 3 buyers examined him with the focused, evaluative attention that men of commerce give to a particularly significant acquisition. One gestured for him to turn slowly, allowing assessment from every angle. Another asked him to speak, testing the quality of his voice and the purity of his Latin pronunciation. The third simply watched with an expression that Marcus could not read, but that made him want to disappear into the marble floor. The negotiation that followed treated Marcus as if he were simultaneously the most important object in the room and completely invisible. The men discussed his qualities with clinical precision. His bone structure suggested he would maintain a pleasing appearance for several years. His Gallic complexion, fair but not pale, combined exotic appeal with classical aesthetics. His voice was clear and showed potential for training in music and recitation. His physical health appeared excellent, reducing the risk of early loss on investment. The price they settled on was extraordinary. Marcus could not follow the exact figures, but the reactions of the household servants who overheard told him that his sale price exceeded what most Romans would earn in a decade of skilled labor. He was not being purchased as a household slave. He was being acquired as a luxury commodity, his value calculated based on criteria that he did not yet understand. What Marcus could not know was that these three men senators named Lucius Cornelius Rufus, Publius Caecilius Metellus, and Gnaeus Domitius Calvus operated as a consortium that shared ownership of expensive acquisitions. They maintained a private facility outside the city specifically designed for the systematic exploitation of young men. Marcus was not being purchased for domestic service. He was being fed into a machine. The contract was signed with witnesses and official seals treating the transfer of a human life with the same legal formality used for property transactions or business agreements. Marcus watched his ownership change hands and understood, with the clarity that survival instincts sometimes provide, that something fundamental had just shifted. The wooden horse hidden in his pallet felt suddenly like the last fragment of a world that was being systematically demolished. Transport happened immediately. Before Marcus could return to the servants' quarters, before he could retrieve his hidden horse, before he could process what was occurring, he was chained at the wrists and loaded into a covered wagon. Inside were three other boys purchased from different sources across the region. Their ages ranged from 11 to 15, and their faces carried the same mixture of confusion and building terror that Marcus felt compressing his chest. The oldest boy, perhaps 15, had clearly been in the system before. His eyes carried a flatness that Marcus would later learn to recognize as the look of someone who had already been broken and reassembled into a different shape. When Marcus tried to speak to ask where they were being taken, this boy shook his head with small, tight movement. Conversation is forbidden. They will punish all of us. They traveled in silence as darkness swallowed the road. It was during this journey in the rattling darkness of the wagon that Marcus realized he had lost the wooden horse. It was still hidden in his sleeping pallet back at the Aurelius estate, and the understanding that he would never see it again hit him with a force that was physical. He pressed his hand against his hip where the horse used to rest and felt only the rough fabric of his new tunic. The last connection to his father's hands, to his mother's voice, to the green hills where he had been free, was gone. What Marcus did not know was that the horse would have been taken from him regardless. At the facility where he was being transported, the systematic destruction of personal identity began with a ceremony that the operators called the burning. Every new arrival's personal possessions were collected and destroyed by fire in a ritual witnessed by all the boys currently housed at the facility. The message was clear and deliberate. Your previous life is fuel. Watch it become ash. The facility emerged from darkness like something from a fever dream. Torchlight revealed high stone walls topped with iron spikes, enclosing grounds that combined the security architecture of a military fortress with the decorative elements of an imperial palace. Gardens lined pathways between buildings whose facades featured carved marble and painted frescoes depicting scenes of classical mythology. The main entrance was flanked by columns that would not have looked out of place on a senator's urban mansion. The contrast was calculated. Every element of the facility's design served a psychological purpose. The luxury confused young minds about the nature of their captivity. The beauty created cognitive dissonance between the elegance of the surroundings and the horror of what occurred within them. Boys who were housed in silk-lined rooms with comfortable furniture and access to books and musical instruments found it harder to maintain the clarity of understanding that they were prisoners. The cage was gilded so thoroughly that its bars became almost invisible. Marcus was processed with the efficiency of a well-run operation. He was bathed again more thoroughly this time, his skin scrubbed and treated with oils that smelled of expensive botanicals. His hair was cut and styled. His old tunic was taken and replaced with clothing that was comfortable but designed to be easily removed. A physician examined him with professional detachment, documenting his physical condition on a scroll that would become part of his permanent file. Then came the burning. Marcus was led to a courtyard at the center of the facility where approximately 30 other boys stood in neat rows. Some were recent arrivals like himself, their eyes still wide with unprocessed fear. Others had been in residence for months or years, their postures and expressions carrying varying degrees of the flatness Marcus had first noticed in the boy from the wagon. At the center of the courtyard was a bronze brazier, its coals glowing orange in the darkness. The 4 new arrivals were brought forward one at a time. Each was asked to surrender any personal items they had managed to retain during transport. A Greek boy of perhaps 12 produced a small clay medallion bearing the image of Athena. A Germanic youth, tall and blond, with the defiant posture of someone who had not yet learned submission, reluctantly handed over a leather wristband braided by his mother. The youngest boy, barely 11, surrendered a scrap of fabric that he clutched so tightly they had to pry it from his fingers. Marcus had nothing to give. His wooden horse was already left behind in a sleeping pallet that was probably being cleaned by whatever slave had replaced him in the Aurelius household. But the ceremony was designed to work regardless. He was made to watch as each boy's possessions were placed in the brazier and consumed by flames. The Greek boy stared at the fire with tears running silently down his face. The Germanic youth clenched his fists so hard that his nails drew blood from his palms. The youngest boy made a sound that was not quite a scream and not quite a sob, but something in between that Marcus would hear in his dreams for the rest of his life. The overseer who conducted the ceremony was a man of about 25 tall and well-built, with a face that might have been handsome if his eyes had contained any warmth. His name was Drusus, and Marcus would later learn that Drusus had entered this very facility at age 12 and had survived long enough to be promoted from commodity to staff. The system that had consumed his childhood had offered him a choice: become an enforcer or be disposed of. Drusus had chosen survival, and the cost of that choice was visible in everything except his eyes, which had been dead for years. Drusus spoke to the assembled boys with the practiced cadence of someone who had delivered this speech many times. Your names before today are sounds that no longer have meaning. Your families, if they exist, have been compensated and have accepted terms. Your previous identities were drafts. Your real lives begin now. The words were designed to achieve a specific psychological effect, and Marcus could feel them working, even as his mind resisted them. The fire that consumed other boys' possessions was meant to demonstrate the futility of holding on to the past. The presence of long-term residents with their careful movements and empty eyes was meant to show what successful adaptation looked like. The luxury of the surroundings was meant to suggest that what was being offered was not imprisonment, but elevation. Marcus was assigned to a room that confirmed the facility's commitment to calculated comfort. Silk hangings covered the walls. The bed was more comfortable than anything he had slept on in his life, including the years when he had been free. A small table held books, writing materials, and a lyre. There were fresh flowers in a ceramic vase, and the air carried the scent of incense. The windows were barred with iron, the door locked from the outside, and every surface in the room, Marcus would eventually notice, was designed to prevent self-harm. No sharp edges, no hooks strong enough to support weight, no materials that could be fashioned into tools of escape or instruments of self-destruction. The room's beauty was a mask over its true function. This was a containment unit engineered to house a human product while preserving its commercial value. That first night, alone in a room more luxurious than anything he had known, Marcus pressed his empty hand against his hip and tried to remember the exact shape of the wooden horse. He traced its outline in the air with his finger. The flowing mane, the legs positioned mid-gallop, the small notch where his father's knife had slipped during carving, creating an imperfection that had always made Marcus smile because it proved the horse had been made by human hands rather than purchased from a craftsman's stall. He could still feel the shape, but it was already beginning to blur at the edges. In the months ahead, he would lose more details, and each lost detail would feel like losing his father again. The system understood this. The erasure of identity was not achieved through a single dramatic act, but through the gradual dissolution of memory, the slow fading of connections to a self that once existed. The burning was just the beginning. Part 2, the machine. Training began the next morning with what appeared to be harmless education. Marcus was assigned tutors who taught him music, poetry, conversation, and the social graces expected of someone who would interact with Rome's educated elite. He learned to play the lyre with technical precision. He memorized verses from Virgil and Ovid. He practiced the art of conversation, learning which topics pleased different types of men and how to steer dialogue towards subjects that made his companions feel intelligent and appreciated. These lessons were presented as opportunities. His tutors spoke of the advantages Marcus was receiving, the education that most freeborn Romans could not afford. They compared his situation favorably to the lives of common laborers who would never read a book or hear a properly played instrument. They encouraged him to feel gratitude for what was being provided, and the most dangerous part was that a portion of Marcus's mind found their arguments convincing. This was the first stage of conditioning, and it operated on a principle that modern psychologists would recognize as cognitive reframing. By providing genuine benefits alongside systematic exploitation, the facility created confusion about the nature of the experience. Boys who received education, comfortable housing, and adequate nutrition found it psychologically difficult to reconcile these benefits with their growing understanding of what was actually being demanded of them. The Greek boy who had arrived on the same night as Marcus was named Alexios. He was 12 years old, the son of a school teacher from Corinth, who had been captured by pirates during a coastal raid and sold into the trafficking network that fed boys to facilities like this one across the empire. Alexios was intelligent, articulate, and possessed the kind of natural curiosity that made him an excellent student. In a different life, he would have become a scholar or teacher himself. In this life, those qualities made him a premium product. Marcus and Alexios were housed in adjacent rooms, and despite strict prohibitions against forming personal bonds, they developed a careful friendship built on whispered conversations during the brief moments when oversight was relaxed. Alexios had a gift for observation and analysis that helped Marcus understand the system they were trapped in. He identified patterns in the facility's operations, recognized the psychological techniques being used against them, and maintained an intellectual clarity that served as a kind of resistance. "It is designed to make us forget who we are," Alexios whispered one night through the thin wall between their rooms. "Every gift they give us is a chain they are placing around our minds. Remember that the education is not for our benefit. It is training us to be more entertaining products." The Germanic boy from the burning ceremony was called Wulfric. He was 14 tall and physically powerful for his age, with the blonde hair and blue eyes that Roman buyers prized for their exotic appeal. Wulfric had been captured during a border raid on his village in the Rhineland, watching his father killed by Roman soldiers before being chained and marched south toward the Mediterranean slave routes. Unlike Marcus and Alexios, who had arrived through economic transactions, Wulfric had entered the system through military violence, and his rage was proportional to that experience. For the first 3 weeks, Wulfric resisted everything. He refused to eat food prepared by Roman hands. He fought the tutors who tried to teach him Latin pronunciation. He tore the silk hangings from his walls and bent the iron bars of his windows until his hands bled. His defiance was magnificent and completely futile, but Marcus watched it with something close to admiration because it represented a refusal to accept what was happening. The facility's response to Wulfric's resistance demonstrated the sophisticated cruelty of its operations. They did not beat him. Visible injuries reduced commercial value and, besides physical punishment, often strengthened resolve rather than breaking it. Instead, they used techniques designed to exhaust resistance through psychological means. Wulfric was subjected to what the facility called adjustment. He was confined in a room barely large enough to stand in, with no light, no sound, and no human contact for periods that stretched from hours to days. When he was released, he was treated with exaggerated kindness, given his favorite foods, offered entertainment, allowed brief access to outdoor spaces where sunlight and fresh air felt like gifts from the gods after the sensory void of confinement. Then, when his psychological defenses had been partially restored by this apparent mercy, he was confined again. The cycle repeated with increasing intensity, creating a pattern of deprivation and relief that gradually taught Wulfric's nervous system to associate compliance with comfort and resistance with suffering. The specific genius of this approach was that it did not require the boy to make a conscious decision to submit. His body learned submission before his mind agreed to it. Marcus watched this transformation with growing horror. The defiant Germanic warrior who had bent iron bars with bleeding hands was systematically dismantled over the course of 2 months. The process was not dramatic. There was no single breaking point, no moment of visible collapse. Instead, Wulfric simply became quieter day by day. His movements, once explosive and unpredictable, gradually acquired the careful grace that marked boys who had learned to anticipate and accommodate their captors' expectations. His voice, which had roared defiance in a language his captors did not understand, softened into the measured tones that the facility's training demanded. The day Marcus heard Wulfric address an overseer as Domini, the Latin word for master, spoken in a voice that carried no trace of irony or resistance, he understood something fundamental about the machine they were trapped in. It did not merely control bodies. It rewired minds. It took the raw material of human identity and reshaped it into something that served the system's purposes. The boy who emerged from adjustment was physically identical to the one who had entered, but something essential had been removed the way a sculptor removes stone to reveal the shape hidden within, except that what was being carved away was everything that made Wulfric himself. But Wulfric's story did not end with submission. It ended 3 months later on a night when the guards found his room empty and the iron bars of his window bent outward with a force that should not have been possible for a boy of his diminished weight. They found him in the garden beneath the oldest olive tree in the facility's grounds, where he had used his leather belt and the lowest branch to make a choice that represented in its terrible way the last active agency available to him. The Germanic boy who had fought iron bars with bleeding hands had found the only escape the system could not prevent. The facility recorded his loss with the standard notation, but among the older boys who had watched Wulfric's transformation, the event carried a meaning that the ledger could not contain. Some of them whispered that what Wulfric had done was not defeat, but victory, the only victory still possible inside the machine. Marcus did not agree with this interpretation, but he understood why they needed to believe it. When every form of resistance has been eliminated, redefining the terms of defeat is the last available act of defiance. Alexios recognized the technique from descriptions he had read in his father's books about Athenian methods of training war captives centuries earlier. They are using learned helplessness, he told Marcus during one of their whispered conversations. When resistance always leads to suffering and compliance always leads to relief, the mind eventually stops choosing and simply follows the path of least pain. It is not weakness. It is how every animal brain is built. They have simply learned to exploit it with precision. The understanding did not protect them. Knowledge of how a trap works does not prevent it from closing. Marcus's own conditioning was more subtle than Wulfric's, because he had arrived with less resistance to overcome. The farm boy from Gaul, who had already spent 2 years as a household slave, had partially adapted to a subordinate role. The facility's techniques built on this foundation, gradually expanding the boundaries of what Marcus would accept as normal. The progression was methodical. Music lessons transitioned into lessons on how to entertain during private gatherings. Conversation training expanded to include instruction on how to read a patron's moods and adjust behavior accordingly. Physical conditioning, presented as health maintenance, was actually designed to shape Marcus's body according to the aesthetic preferences of the facility's clientele. His meals were calculated to maintain the slender build that Roman taste preferred. His skin treatments were designed to keep his complexion soft and unmarked. His movements were choreographed to emphasize youth and availability. Sleep deprivation was woven into the training schedule with surgical precision. Marcus was awakened at irregular intervals for lessons, inspections, or exercises that served no apparent purpose other than disrupting the rest necessary for mental clarity. The chronic exhaustion that resulted made him more susceptible to suggestion and less capable of maintaining the emotional boundaries that separated his true self from the compliant persona the facility was constructing. The most insidious technique involved manufactured hope, followed by strategic disappointment. After several months of training, Marcus was told by Drusus that his performance had been exceptional and that he was being considered for a special assignment that could lead to improved conditions, perhaps even a path toward eventual freedom. Marcus knew intellectually that he should not believe this. Alexios had warned him that false hope was a tool of control designed to create emotional investment that could be weaponized. But hope is not an intellectual decision. It is a biological response wired into human neurology so deeply that awareness of manipulation cannot fully prevent it from taking hold. For 2 weeks, Marcus allowed himself to imagine a future beyond the facility's walls. He worked harder at his training, not out of submission, but out of belief that effort might lead to liberation. He slept better because hope provides a chemical comfort that temporarily overrides chronic stress. He even began to see the facility's luxuries as genuine benefits rather than elements of a control system. When the truth was revealed, the psychological impact was precisely calibrated. The special assignment was not freedom. It was Marcus's first full service to a paying client. The hope that had been carefully constructed over 2 weeks was demolished in seconds, and the emotional collapse that followed was exploited to deepen his conditioning. The boy who had believed he might still escape finally understood that escape had never been a possibility. The hope itself had been manufactured as a tool of control, and his willingness to believe it demonstrated how thoroughly the system had already reshaped his thinking. Marcus was not the only one being processed. The facility housed approximately 30 to 40 boys at any given time, with new arrivals replacing those who were sold, transferred, or disposed of at a rate that maintained consistent inventory levels. Each boy was at a different stage of conditioning, and the facility's operators used this diversity strategically. New arrivals could observe boys at various stages of the process, from recent captures, still showing resistance, to fully conditioned products who moved through the facility with the polished grace of trained entertainers. This spectrum served as both warning and roadmap. Boys could see exactly where they were headed and could observe that those who arrived at complete compliance were rewarded with privileges, comfort, and the absence of the suffering that accompanied resistance. The hierarchy among the boys themselves was carefully engineered to prevent solidarity. Boys who reported infractions by their peers received small privileges, better food, more comfortable sleeping arrangements, brief periods of outdoor access. These rewards created a system of mutual surveillance that was more effective than any number of guards. Boys who might have supported each other instead became instruments of the system's control, each one a potential informant whose loyalty to fellow captives could be purchased for the price of an extra meal. Friendships were identified and disrupted through separation, punishment, or reassignment. The careful conversations between Marcus and Alexios were eventually detected, and Alexios was moved to a different section of the facility where their contact was eliminated. The loss hit Marcus harder than any physical punishment could have, because it demonstrated that even the small human connections he had managed to maintain were not beyond the system's reach. The facility's operation was not an isolated phenomenon. It was one node in a network that spanned the entire Roman Empire, connected by transportation routes, financial systems, and a client base that reached into the highest levels of Roman society. Understanding the scale of this network is essential, because it reveals that Marcus's experience was not exceptional. It was standard operating procedure, replicated in every major city, from Londinium in the foggy north to Alexandria in the scorching south. The network operated through a hierarchy of facilities ranked by the wealth and status of their clientele. At the top were establishments like the one holding Marcus, which served senators, generals, and the wealthiest merchants. These facilities invested heavily in training, conditioning, and presentation because their clients demanded products of the highest quality. Mid-tier facilities served wealthy but not elite Romans, provincial administrators, successful traders, and military officers below the rank of general. Lower-tier operations served anyone with enough coin, and their conditions were correspondingly brutal, with less investment in conditioning and more reliance on simple physical control. Boys moved through this hierarchy in one direction only: downward. A boy who aged out of premium service at a top-tier facility was sold to a mid-tier operation. When his value declined further, he was transferred again. Each level extracted diminishing returns from a diminishing product until the boy was no longer commercially viable at any level. At that point, disposal was the final transaction in a chain that had begun with a child being torn from his family. Boys were collected from every corner of the empire, with different regions prized for different qualities. Celtic boys from Britain and Gaul were valued for fair complexions and the fierce spirits that made their eventual submission more satisfying to clients who enjoyed the sense of conquering barbarian vitality. Greek youths commanded premium prices for their intellectual refinement and cultural sophistication qualities that allowed them to serve as both physical companions and engaging conversationalists. Germanic captives were sought for their physical strength and exotic appearance. Their blonde hair and blue eyes, representing conquest of the northern frontiers, made intimate and personal. The transportation networks that moved this human cargo across the empire were as sophisticated as those used for grain silk or precious metals. Specialized ships carried holds full of chained boys across the Mediterranean, their captains experienced in maintaining cargo viability during voyages that could last weeks. Overland routes moved smaller groups through mountain passes and along military roads with way stations where boys could be housed, fed, and prepared for the next stage of their journey. The mortality rate during transport was approximately 15%, a figure that was factored into pricing as acceptable overhead, the same way a grain merchant accounts for spoilage. The financial infrastructure supporting this trade was equally sophisticated. Consortium arrangements like the one that had purchased Marcus allowed wealthy Romans to share the costs and risks of expensive acquisitions while dividing access among multiple investors. Banking networks provided financing for purchases and construction of facilities. Insurance arrangements covered losses from disease escape or premature death. The entire apparatus operated with the same commercial efficiency as any other profitable Roman enterprise. Roman law provided essential protection for the system's operators. Male concubines occupied a legal gray zone where traditional slave protections, already minimal, were further reduced by their classification as luxury goods rather than laborers. They could not seek protection from authorities because the authorities were often clients. They could not form legal relationships because their existence was defined entirely by their utility to their owners. They could not own property, testify in court, or exercise any right that might interfere with their commercial function. The most chilling discovery from the archaeological evidence was the client records found in sealed chambers beneath the facility. These records documented not just the names of visitors, but the frequency and nature of their visits, creating a portrait of Rome's elite that no official history had ever revealed. The names included senators who had voted for laws protecting public morality, military commanders who were celebrated for defending Rome's honor, philosophers who had written treatises on virtue, justice, and the proper treatment of fellow human beings. Even some early Christian leaders, men who would later be remembered as moral authorities, appeared on lists of regular clients. The hypocrisy was not accidental but structural. Roman society was constructed so that public morality and private behavior existed in separate compartments, with the system providing the walls between them. A senator could advocate for family values on the floor of the Senate in the morning and visit a facility that exploited children in the evening, and neither activity was understood to contradict the other because the legal and social infrastructure ensured that the children being exploited were not recognized as people whose suffering counted. This was the machine's deepest horror. Not that individual Romans were capable of cruelty, because cruelty is a human universal that requires no special explanation. The horror was that an entire civilization had constructed legal, economic, and social systems that transformed individual cruelty into institutional efficiency. The suffering of 800,000 boys across 5 centuries was not the product of 800,000 individual decisions to be evil. It was the product of a system designed so that evil could be practiced at industrial scale while maintaining the appearance of civilization. Marcus spent 14 months in the facility before his first assignment to a client. The boy who entered the reception room that evening bore almost no resemblance to the farm boy from Gaul who had once carved wooden animals with his father. His body had been shaped, his mind conditioned, his responses trained until the performance of compliance was so thoroughly integrated that it appeared natural to everyone except Marcus himself, who could still occasionally observe his own behavior from a dissociative distance that was his last remaining defense. The client was Lucius Cornelius Rufus, one of the 3 senators who co-owned the facility. He was a man in his late 50s, physically unremarkable, with a public reputation as a champion of Roman moral values, who had spoken eloquently in the Senate about the importance of protecting the traditional family. He arrived at the facility with the casual confidence of a property owner, inspecting an investment, examining Marcus with the evaluative attention one might give to a newly purchased horse or a recently completed renovation. The encounter that followed was the culmination of everything the facility had been designed to produce. Marcus performed his role with the technical precision his training demanded, his body executing responses that had been rehearsed until they operated independently of his conscious will. The horror was not merely what was done to him, though that was terrible enough. The horror was that the machine had succeeded in making him an active participant in his own exploitation, his trained responses creating an illusion of consent that served to protect his abuser's self-image. After Lucius departed, Marcus was returned to his quarters for what the facility called recovery and preparation. The clinical language was deliberate. It framed the aftermath of exploitation as a maintenance procedure, the same way one might describe servicing equipment between uses. Marcus lay on his silk-covered bed in his beautifully appointed prison and stared at the barred window while his mind performed the dissociative retreat that had become his primary survival mechanism. He thought about the wooden horse. Specifically, he tried to remember the notch where his father's knife had slipped. But the detail that had once been sharp in his memory was blurring, now fading like ink exposed to sunlight. He could remember that the notch existed, but could no longer visualize its exact shape or location. The erasure of identity that the facility had engineered was proceeding according to plan, and dissolving his connections to a self that had once existed in the green hills of Gaul. In the weeks and months that followed, Marcus served multiple clients with the efficiency that the facility demanded. Military commanders fresh from campaigns along the empire's frontiers, wealthy merchants celebrating successful ventures, respected scholars and philosophers whose public writings about human dignity bore no relationship to their private appetites. Each encounter reinforced the lesson that the facility existed not as an aberration within Roman society, but as a logical expression of its deepest principles. Power entitled its holders to unlimited access to the bodies and lives of those beneath them. This was not a perversion of Roman values. It was their purest expression. The psychological toll accumulated with each encounter like sediment, building at the bottom of a river, invisible from the surface, but gradually changing the shape of everything beneath. Marcus developed the dissociative responses that allowed him to survive, but at the cost of losing connection to his own emotional experience. He could observe his life from a distance as if watching events happen to someone else, but he could no longer feel them in the way that makes experience meaningful. Some boys did not develop these defenses and broke completely under the accumulated trauma. Marcus witnessed two boys retreat into states of catatonia from which they never emerged, their minds simply shutting down like overtaxed mechanisms that have exceeded their operational limits. These boys were removed from the facility with the same clinical efficiency used for any other form of inventory disposal. Their bodies were carried to the burial chamber beneath the eastern courtyard, added to rows of remains that documented the human cost of Rome's appetite for exploitation. The facility's records, later recovered by archaeologists, documented these disposals with the same notation used for all losses. Inventory reduced by 1 unit, replacement required from current stock. The language was not accidentally dehumanizing. It was precisely dehumanizing, deliberately designed to prevent any emotional recognition that the units being reduced were children who had once been loved. The transformation of Alexios was the event that came closest to destroying what remained of Marcus's psychological defenses. The Greek boy who had been Marcus's ally, an intellectual companion, the one who had identified the conditioning techniques being used against them, the one who had maintained analytical clarity as a form of resistance, was assigned to the facility's training staff after 18 months of conditioning. Marcus encountered him in a corridor one morning and barely recognized him. The boy who had whispered observations about learned helplessness through a wall at night was now dressed in the uniform of a junior overseer, his posture carrying the careful authority of someone who had accepted the system's logic entirely. His eyes, which had once sparkled with intellectual curiosity and quiet defiance, carried the same flatness that Marcus had first noticed in the boy from the transport wagon. The same flatness that characterized Drusus and every other former captive who had been promoted from product to staff. Alexios Marcus whispered using the name that connected them to their earliest days in the facility. The boy who had been Alexios looked at Marcus with an expression that contained no recognition of shared experience. "My name is Felix now. You should return to your quarters and prepare for this evening's schedule." The exchange lasted perhaps 10 seconds, but its impact was devastating because it demonstrated the machine's ultimate capability. It did not merely exploit its victims, it transformed them into perpetuators. The system that had consumed Alexios' childhood had offered him a choice between disposal and collaboration, and he had chosen collaboration, and the cost of that choice was the complete dissolution of the person he had been. Marcus understood, watching Alexios walk away in his overseer's uniform, that the machine was not powered by the cruelty of individual operators. It was powered by the survival instinct of its victims, each one faced with an impossible choice that ensured the system would always have willing enforcers. The boys who became overseers were not monsters. They were survivors who had paid for their survival with everything that made them human. Part 3, the ledger. Marcus entered his second year at the facility with the knowledge that his commercial viability was beginning to decline. The boyish features that had made him valuable were maturing into those of a young man, and the facility's clientele overwhelmingly preferred the aesthetic of youth. His handlers discussed his future in terms that made clear the trajectory. Premium product status would be maintained for perhaps 6 more months. After that, options included transfer to a lower-tier facility, surgical modification to preserve a youthful appearance, or disposal. During these final months, Marcus encountered an act of kindness that was as unexpected as it was dangerous. An older boy named Septimus, who had been in the facility for nearly 5 years and served as a senior attendant responsible for preparing younger boys for client sessions, began leaving small things in Marcus's room. An extra portion of bread wrapped in cloth, a blanket during cold nights when the facility reduced heating to cut costs. Once a small piece of charcoal that Marcus used to draw on the underside of his table, sketching animals from memory in the hours when he could not sleep. Septimus never spoke about what he was doing, and Marcus understood that acknowledging the gifts would endanger them both. The facility's surveillance systems were designed to detect and punish exactly this kind of unsanctioned human connection. But the gifts continued small acts of care delivered in silence, and Marcus realized that Septimus was demonstrating something the machine had tried to make impossible. That empathy could survive inside the system. That kindness did not require permission. The discovery came as such things always did through the facility's network of informants. A younger boy desperate for the small privileges that reporting infractions could earn mentioned the extra food to an overseer. Septimus was removed from his position within the hour. Marcus never saw him again, but he heard from other boys that Septimus was transferred to one of the lower-tier facilities, where conditions were harsh enough that survival beyond a few months was unusual. The loss was different from losing Alexios. Alexios had been transformed by the system, his personality dissolved and rebuilt to serve the machine's purposes. Septimus had been destroyed for refusing to let the system transform him completely. Both outcomes achieved the same result: the elimination of human connection. But Septimus's fate carried an additional cruelty because it demonstrated that compassion inside the machine was not merely futile but dangerous, that the system actively punished any expression of care that it had not authorized and could not control. The mathematics of the system were simple and merciless. A boy entered the machine at the peak of his commercial value and was exploited with maximum efficiency until that value declined below a threshold of profitability. The average duration of usefulness was approximately 4 years from initial acquisition to final disposal. Disease, psychological collapse, and physical deterioration from repeated exploitation claimed most boys long before they could age out naturally. The few who survived to adulthood were typically so damaged that they died within months of leaving the system, their bodies and minds unable to function in any environment that did not provide the structured abuse they had been conditioned to expect. Castration was presented as an option to some boys approaching adolescence, a surgical modification that could extend commercial viability by preserving the physical characteristics of youth. The procedure was performed by physicians whose medical knowledge was advanced for its time, but entirely inadequate for the operations they were conducting. Mortality rates exceeded 30%, with many survivors suffering complications that eventually proved fatal. Those who survived intact, if the word can be applied to such violation, might gain an additional 2 to 3 years of service before their bodies failed in other ways. Marcus was spared this particular horror, though he witnessed others undergo it and understood that the decision was not made out of compassion, but calculation. His handlers determined that the cost of the procedure combined with its risk of loss exceeded the projected additional revenue from extended service. In the language of the ledger, the investment did not justify the expenditure. His body, like everything else in the facility, was subject to cost-benefit analysis. The wasting disease that eventually claimed Marcus was common among boys in the system. Modern medical analysis of skeletal remains suggests a combination of tuberculosis and the immunological collapse that accompanies prolonged psychological trauma. Chronic stress suppresses the immune system through mechanisms that Roman physicians could not have understood, creating vulnerability to infections that healthy bodies might have resisted. Marcus began showing symptoms in the early winter of his second year at the facility. A persistent cough that deepened over weeks. Weight loss that his already controlled diet could not reverse. Episodes of fever that left him soaked in sweat and unable to perform his duties. The facility's physician diagnosed the condition with practiced familiarity, having seen it claim dozens of boys before, and Marcus was moved to an isolation room where his illness would not affect the health or availability of still viable products. The isolation room stripped away the facility's carefully maintained illusions. There were no silk hangings here, no comfortable furniture, no musical instruments or books, just a narrow bed, a chamber pot, and walls that bore the scratched marks of previous occupants who had counted their remaining days in this room. Marcus was no longer a product worth maintaining. He was inventory approaching its expiration, and the facility saw no reason to invest in the comfort of assets that would soon be written off. In the clarity that sometimes accompanies the final stages of serious illness, Marcus experienced moments of memory so vivid that they felt more real than the room around him. He could see his father's workshop with perfect detail, the curls of wood shavings on the earthen floor, the tools hanging from iron hooks on the wall, the small window that admitted a shaft of afternoon light in which dust motes danced like tiny planets. He could smell the wood fresh-cut oak and aged pine, and beneath it the earthy scent of the fields outside. He remembered things he had not thought about in years. The way his mother would hum a Gallic melody while grinding grain, a song whose words she claimed to have forgotten, but whose melody persisted like water finding its way through stone. The feeling of cold stream water on his feet during the summers when he and the neighboring children would wade through the creek that bordered their farmland. The particular shade of green that the wheat fields turned in late spring, a color that existed nowhere in Rome, and that Marcus had not seen since the day he was loaded into a slave trader's wagon. He remembered the day a storm destroyed part of their storage shed, and his father had spent 3 days rebuilding it, working in rain that turned the ground to mud because the grain inside could not afford exposure to weather. Marcus had helped handing tools and holding planks while his father hammered. At the time, it had felt like ordinary work. Now, from the distance of years and suffering, he understood that it had been something else entirely. It had been a father showing his son that the proper response to damage was repair. That when something you loved was threatened, you stood in the rain and you fixed it. Lucius Decimus had not been able to stand in the rain for his son. The system that consumed Marcus was designed to be stronger than any individual father's love, and the economic forces that drove a freedman to sell his child were as impersonal and irresistible as the weather that destroyed the harvest. But the memory of his father's hands working in the rain, refusing to let the storm win, remained in Marcus's mind long after nearly everything else had been stripped away. He remembered the evening his father carved the wooden horse. Lucius had been repairing a cart axle and had a piece of oak, left over, a piece too small for any practical purpose, but too beautiful to discard. He had turned it in his hands for a moment, then looked at Marcus with the expression that always preceded a gift, a mixture of pleasure in giving and awareness that the best gifts are unexpected. "What shall we make of this?" his father had asked, though they both knew the answer. Marcus always wanted horses. In the fever dreams that consumed his final weeks, Marcus sometimes heard his father's voice calling across the hills of Gaul, the sound carrying over distance and time with a clarity that physical acoustics could not explain. He could not always understand the words, but the voice itself was enough. It was the sound of the world he had come from, the world where he had been a person rather than a product, where his value was measured in love rather than commercial utility. During one lucid interval between fever episodes, Marcus used his fingernail to scratch a mark on the wall beside his bed. It was not his name or a message. It was the outline of a small horse, crude and barely visible, drawn with the last energy of a body that was shutting down. The horse's mane was flowing and its legs were positioned mid-gallop, the same pose his father had carved into the original. The notch was there too, or at least Marcus's memory of where it should be, that small imperfection that proved the original had been made by loving hands. It was the last mark Marcus made on the physical world. He died on a cold morning in early spring, approximately 16 months after arriving at the facility and 4 years after being sold by his father to pay debts incurred by a failed harvest. He was 15 years old. His death was recorded in the facility's ledger with the standard notation: Marcus, Gallic origin, acquired autumn 96 AD, cause of termination, wasting disease. Inventory reduced by 1 unit. Replacement required from current stock. The entry occupied a single line in a document containing over 3,000 similar entries, each one representing a human life reduced to an accounting notation. His body was carried to the underground burial chamber beneath the eastern courtyard and placed in the next available position in the rows of remains. No funeral rites were performed, no marker was placed. The boy whose father had promised to come for him was disposed of with less ceremony than Romans typically gave to a worn-out farm animal. The facility's operations continued without interruption. New inventory replaced old. The machine fed and was fed. 16 centuries passed. When the archaeological team, led by Dr. Elena Rossi, unsealed the burial chamber in 2014, they were confronted with evidence of systematic horror that exceeded their professional preparation. The 127 skeletal remains they documented represented only the final generation of the facility's operation, a fraction of the estimated 3,000 boys processed during its century of activity. Several members of the excavation team required psychological counseling in the weeks following the discovery, their professional training insufficient preparation for the emotional impact of cataloging evidence of industrialized cruelty against children. The site itself told a story before any analysis began. The remains were arranged in precise rows with consistent spacing, demonstrating that even the disposal of dead boys was conducted according to organizational protocols. There was no haste in the arrangement, no evidence of mass burial during a crisis. These bodies had been placed one at a time over decades, each edition extending the rows with the methodical care of a filing clerk, adding documents to an archive. The orderliness was perhaps the most disturbing element because it demonstrated that the killing of children had been normalized to such an extent that their burial was a routine administrative task requiring no more emotional engagement than shelving inventory. Forensic analysis of the bones revealed a consistent pattern of physical trauma and physiological stress that painted a detailed portrait of what life in the facility had entailed. Stress markers in teeth and vertebrae indicated years of chronic psychological torture. Bone density patterns showed the effects of controlled malnutrition designed to maintain specific body types. Healed fractures and joint damage suggested repeated physical manipulation. And in several cases, skeletal evidence of surgical modification confirmed historical accounts of procedures performed to alter boys' physical development according to commercial specifications. The ledger found in its sealed clay jar provided the documentary evidence that connected individual remains to the system that had produced them. Over 3,000 entries spanning approximately 100 years of continuous operation, each one recording the acquisition, utilization, and disposal of a human life with the same clinical precision used for any other business inventory. The names came from every corner of the empire: Gallic, Greek, Germanic, Egyptian, British, Syrian, Numidian. Each name representing a family, destroyed a childhood, consumed a future, erased. The client records found in a separate sealed chamber provided the final piece of the historical picture. Names that appeared in these records were cross-referenced with known figures from Roman history, and the results challenged established narratives about some of the empire's most celebrated citizens. Senators who had championed moral legislation, military heroes whose victories were commemorated in stone, philosophers whose writings about justice and human dignity were still studied in universities, religious leaders whose moral authority had shaped the development of Western ethics. Their names appeared on schedules of regular visits, accompanied by notations about their preferences and the specific boys assigned to serve them. The gap between their public personas and their documented private behavior was not merely hypocritical. It was structural, built into a civilization that maintained separate systems of morality for public and private life, with the suffering of children serving as the hidden foundation on which respectable society was constructed. The financial records completed the picture by revealing the economic scale of the operation. The facility generated annual revenues that funded projects of lasting cultural significance. Archaeological cross-referencing suggested that profits from the network of facilities across the empire contributed to the construction of public buildings, military campaigns, and infrastructure projects that are still celebrated as achievements of Roman civilization. The architectural marvels that tourists photograph today were built in part with money earned from the systematic destruction of children. Every grand column casts a shadow, and some of those shadows have shapes that history has tried very hard not to see. The facility appears to have operated until approximately 150 AD, when changing social attitudes under the influence of Stoic philosophy and early Christian ethics made the most blatant forms of child exploitation more difficult to maintain publicly. But the archaeological record and contemporary historical accounts make clear that the closure of visible facilities did not end the trade. It simply drove it underground, creating shadow networks that continued to operate with greater secrecy and perhaps even greater cruelty, freed from the minimal oversight that public visibility had provided. The fate that consumed Marcus was not historical aberration. It was systematic practice maintained for over 5 centuries by the most powerful civilization the ancient world had ever produced. 800,000 young men fed into a machine that operated with bureaucratic efficiency in the service of appetites that Roman society chose not to see. Their suffering was not hidden because it was rare. It was hidden because it was ubiquitous, woven so deeply into the fabric of Roman life that acknowledging it would have required questioning the foundations of the civilization itself. And here is the truth that connects Marcus's story to ours across 19 centuries of supposed progress. The business model that enabled this systematic destruction has never truly disappeared. Today, an estimated 27 million people live in conditions of modern slavery, with children representing more than one quarter of these victims. The methods have evolved. Digital communication has replaced papyrus ledgers. International trafficking networks have replaced Mediterranean shipping routes. The terminology has changed from concubinus to trafficking victim. But the fundamental dynamic remains identical to the one that consumed Marcus in a gilded facility outside Rome. Powerful individuals exploiting vulnerable populations while society maintains carefully constructed ignorance about what is happening behind closed doors. Consider the parallels with the precision they deserve. The Roman system collected boys from economically devastated regions where families had no alternatives. Modern trafficking networks operate most effectively in areas of extreme poverty, conflict, and social disruption, recruiting victims from communities where economic desperation overrides every other consideration. The Roman system used legal structures to prevent victims from seeking help. Modern trafficking relies on immigration laws, debt bondage, and documentation control to achieve the same result. The Roman facility where Marcus was held used luxury and education as tools of psychological control, creating confusion about the nature of captivity. Modern trafficking operations frequently use a period of apparent generosity, what law enforcement calls the honeymoon phase, to establish emotional dependence before exploitation begins. The Roman system turned victims into enforcers through a carefully managed hierarchy of privilege. Modern trafficking operations routinely promote long-term victims to supervisory roles using the same psychological mechanism that transformed Alexios from resistor to overseer. The same psychological techniques that Roman trainers used to break down resistance. Isolation and learned helplessness, manufactured hope. Identity erasure appear in contemporary trafficking operations documented by law enforcement agencies worldwide. These are not coincidental similarities. They are convergent solutions to the same problem, which is how to transform a human being into a compliant product. The human mind has not changed in 2,000 years, and neither have the most effective methods for destroying it. The same economic incentives that made Roman facilities profitable continue to fuel modern exploitation, with global revenues from forced labor and trafficking estimated at over $150 billion annually. To put that number in perspective, it exceeds the annual revenue of most Fortune 500 companies. This is not a marginal criminal enterprise. It is one of the most profitable industries on earth, and its profit margins would have been recognizable to the consortium that purchased Marcus from Gaius Aurelius in 96 AD. The same social mechanisms that allowed Roman senators to champion public morality while consuming children's lives in private operate today in institutions that profit from systematic abuse while maintaining reputations for respectability. The client lists recovered from the Roman facility find their modern equivalent in the names that emerge when trafficking rings are occasionally exposed, names belonging to politicians, business leaders, celebrities, and religious figures whose public images bear no relationship to their documented private conduct. The Roman system survived for 5 centuries not because Romans were uniquely evil, but because they built structures that made evil efficient, profitable, and invisible to anyone who preferred not to see it. Our systems have had 2,000 additional years to refine those same techniques. We remember Marcus not as a line in an ancient ledger, but as a human being who deserved the life that was stolen from him. A boy who loved horses and was loved by a father who carved one from oak with his own hands. A child whose values should have been measured in laughter and growth and the slow accumulation of experiences that build a person, not in the commercial calculations of men who saw children as renewable resources for their own pleasure. The wooden horse that Marcus lost when he was sold the one his father carved on an evening when the hills of Gaul turned copper and gold in the setting sun was never recovered by archaeologists. It was either burned in the Aurelius household's hearth after Marcus's departure, or simply discarded as the valueless possession of a valueless person. But the mark that Marcus scratched on the wall of his isolation room, the crude outline of a horse with a flowing mane and legs positioned mid-gallop, was found during excavation. It had survived 19 centuries of burial, a faint line in stone that represented everything the machine tried to erase and everything it ultimately could not. The boy whose identity was systematically destroyed managed in his final hours to leave behind evidence that he had once been someone who remembered what it felt like to be loved. That small scratched horse is now preserved in a climate-controlled archive in Rome, cataloged as artifact number 2014-0847, described in academic literature as a minor decorative marking of uncertain origin. The scholars who documented it did not connect it to the ledger entry for a Gallic boy named Marcus, who died of wasting disease in the spring of approximately 98 AD. They did not know that the imperfection in the horse's outline, a small notch on its left flank, was not artistic error, but faithful reproduction of a memory that a dying boy refused to let disappear. But we know. And the act of knowing, of refusing to let these stories dissolve into the comfortable silence that powerful civilizations prefer, is the only form of justice still available to us. Marcus cannot be rescued. His suffering cannot be undone. But he can be remembered not as inventory reduced by one unit, but as a child who once stood in a field of wheat with his father and believed that the world was a place where love could protect you. That belief was wrong. The world Marcus lived in had built systems specifically designed to exploit that kind of innocence. And the world we live in has not yet found the courage to dismantle theirs. Next time we journey to medieval Europe to uncover darker truths about religious institutions that claim to serve God while systematically destroying children placed in their care. The machine did not die with Rome, it simply changed its name. Make sure you are subscribed so you do not miss these buried stories that powerful institutions have spent centuries trying to erase. And leave a comment below telling me where you are listening from. Every voice that joins this conversation makes it harder for history to keep its darkest secrets.